Picture this. You're standing at the altar on what should be the happiest day of your life, heart pounding with joy, when suddenly the church doors swing open. Your mother-in-law glides down the aisle in a stunning white gown, her lips curved in a triumphant smirk. The whispers start immediately, guests shifting in their seats, everyone waiting to see if you'll swallow this ultimate insult. But when you finally grab that microphone and speak your truth, the entire reception hall falls into stunned silence. My name is Emily Carson, and until 3:45 p.m. on May 15th, I believed my wedding day would be perfect. The Willamette Valley vineyard stretched out before us like something from a dream rows of budding grapevines catching the afternoon sun, Mount Hood standing sentinel in the distance. I'd spent months planning every detail, from the lavender sprigs tucked into each centerpiece to the jazz quartet playing softly as guests found their seats. Daniel stood at the altar looking devastatingly handsome in his charcoal gray suit, the one we'd picked out together after visiting 5 different shops. His eyes found mine through the crowd, and that crooked smile I'd fallen for 3 years ago spread across his face. This was it. After all the planning, all the stress, all the compromises with his mother about the guest list and menu choices, we were finally here. The string quartet began the processional. My bridesmaids glided down the aisle in their dusty rose dresses, each carrying bouquets of white peonies and eucalyptus. My heart hammered against my ribs as my father squeezed my arm. "Ready, sweetheart," he whispered, and I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Then the doors opened again. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure sweeping through the entrance wore white, not cream, not ivory, but pure, pristine white. The dress was magnificent, a floor-length silk creation with intricate beadwork that caught the light, a dramatic train that pooled behind her like spilled milk. Margaret Hart, my future mother-in-law, paused at the threshold, allowing everyone to take in the full effect of her entrance. The gasps rippled through the crowd like dominoes falling. My cousin Jessica's mouth dropped open. Daniel's Aunt Martha actually stood up from her seat, then slowly sat back down. The photographer, who'd been positioning himself for my entrance, swung his camera toward Margaret instead, his professional instincts overriding social etiquette. Margaret moved down the aisle with deliberate grace, her chin lifted, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth that I'd seen before the same expression she wore when she'd accidentally scheduled her book club during my bridal shower, when she'd suggested Daniel's ex-girlfriend should be invited for closure, when she'd offered to pay for the wedding but only if we held it at her country club. My father's grip on my arm tightened. "That woman," he muttered under his breath, and I could feel the tension radiating from him. He'd never liked Margaret, not since she'd made that comment about my mother's absence, meaning I'd have no one to teach me proper hosting skills. The vineyard's event coordinator, a usually composed woman named Grace, looked between Margaret and me with barely concealed horror. She started toward Margaret, presumably to redirect her, but Margaret waved her off with a dismissive gesture that suggested this was all perfectly planned. Daniel's face had gone pale. I watched him mouth "Mom" in disbelief, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His brother Tom, the best man, leaned in to whisper something, but Daniel shook his head, his jaw tight. The jazz quartet had stopped playing, uncertain whether to continue. Margaret took her seat in the front row, smoothing her dress with deliberate care, ensuring the train was perfectly arranged. She looked directly at me then, and our eyes met across the 30 feet separating us. In that moment, I understood this wasn't an oversight or a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war, delivered in silk and pearls on what should have been my day. The wedding coordinator looked at me questioningly, waiting for my cue. 200 guests sat in stunned silence, their eyes ping-ponging between Margaret in her white gown and me, still frozen at the entrance in my own wedding dress. The spring breeze carried the scent of blooming roses and fresh-cut grass, mocking the tension that had descended over the ceremony like a shroud. I had two choices: let this woman's power play derail my wedding, or walk down that aisle with my head held high and marry the man I loved despite his mother's theatrical cruelty. I took a deep breath, tasting the sweetness of the valley air, and made my decision. The history between Margaret and me stretched back to the very beginning, to that first dinner at the Hart family home 3 years ago. But to understand why her wearing white cut so deep, you need to know about my mother first. Mom died when I was 14, taken by ovarian cancer in just 6 brutal months. Before she passed, she'd made me promise something. "Emily," she'd whispered, her hand thin as paper in mine, "when you get married someday, wear my dress. It's wrapped in tissue in the attic. Make it yours. Make it modern. But keep me with you." That dress, a simple but elegant 1980s creation, had been transformed into what I wore today. Every pearl, every inch of lace carrying her memory. Margaret knew this story. I'd foolishly shared it with her during what I thought was a bonding moment. 2:30 after Daniel's father's funeral 2 years ago. We'd sat in her kitchen, sharing a bottle of wine, and I'd thought maybe, just maybe, we were finding common ground in our grief. How wrong I'd been. The subtle warfare had started almost immediately after Daniel proposed. First came the comments about my career. "Marketing," she'd say, drawing out the word like it tasted sour. "Such an interesting field, though I suppose someone has to sell things." Never mind that I'd worked my way up from unpaid internships to managing multi-million-dollar campaigns for Nike. Never mind that I out-earned her precious Daniel by $20,000 a year. Then came the digs about my background. Margaret had grown up in Boston high society, attended Wellesley, married into even more money. I'd grown up in a 2-bedroom ranch in suburban Portland, worked 3 jobs through Oregon State, and apparently committed the cardinal sin of having a father who drove trucks for a living. "It's admirable," she'd said at one family dinner, "how you've managed to elevate yourself." The financial control was perhaps the most insidious. When Daniel and I got engaged, Margaret immediately offered to pay for the wedding $60,000, no strings attached. Except there were strings. So many strings we could have made a net. The venue had to be suitable, meaning her country club. The caterer had to be established, meaning the one who'd done her wedding 35 years ago. The guest list needed balance, meaning 2/3 would be her friends and business associates. I'd pushed back, gently at first. Daniel and I would pay for our own wedding. I insisted. We'd saved $20,000, enough for something beautiful but intimate. Margaret had actually laughed. $20,000, dear. That barely covers the flowers at a proper wedding. The breaking point came 6 months ago at her annual Christmas party. She'd introduced me to her friends as Daniel's girlfriend. We'd been engaged for 8 months. When I politely corrected her, she'd patted my hand and said, "Oh, I always forget. It's just that Daniel's had so many girlfriends. It's hard to keep track of who's staying." Daniel, bless him, had confronted her that night. I'd heard them arguing in her study, his voice firm, hers dismissive. He'd emerged looking exhausted, and she'd spent the rest of the evening pointedly ignoring both of us. But the next day, she'd called him not me, never me directly to apologize. "I'm just protective of you, darling," she'd said on speakerphone. "You know how mothers are." The pattern was always the same. She'd cross a line. Daniel would defend me. She'd play the victim, and somehow I'd end up being the one who needed to understand and be patient. His sister Sarah had pulled me aside once, after Margaret had spent an entire Sunday brunch criticizing my bridesmaid choices. "She did this to Tom's wife too," Sarah had whispered. "Drove her away completely. They divorced after 2 years. But I wasn't Tom's wife. I'd survived losing my mother, put myself through college, built a career from nothing. I'd learned to smile through corporate boardrooms full of men who assumed I was there to take notes. Margaret Hart, with her perfect pearls and practiced condescension, wasn't going to drive me away from the man I loved. Still, as I stood there in my transformed wedding dress, watching her preen in white, I felt 16 again, motherless, out of place, trying to fit into a world that didn't want me. She'd chosen her weapon perfectly. By wearing white, she wasn't just upstaging me, she was claiming her territory, marking this wedding as hers, reducing me to a supporting player in my own life story. The worst part she knew about my mother's dress. She knew what this day meant to me, and she'd chosen to desecrate it anyway. The reception was held in the vineyard's restored barn, transformed with thousands of fairy lights into something magical. Or it should have been magical. Instead, it felt like walking into an arena where Margaret held court in her pristine white gown, accepting compliments with false modesty while shooting triumphant glances my way. "Oh, this old thing," I heard her tell Daniel's cousin Patricia. "I just thought white was so springtime appropriate. Emily doesn't mind, she's not one of those controlling brides." She laughed, that tinkling sound that made my teeth ache. "Besides, there's room for two beautiful women in white at a wedding. Don't you think?" The comparison started immediately. Margaret had positioned herself near the entrance, ensuring every guest who entered would see her first. "Margaret, you look absolutely radiant," Daniel's business partner exclaimed. "You could be the bride yourself." "Well," Margaret replied, smoothing her beaded bodice, "I did tell the saleswoman I needed something special for my son's wedding. She insisted this was perfect. Who was I to argue?" She paused, then added with calculated timing, "Emily's dress is lovely too, of course, so—" Vintage. I stood by the wedding cake, my hands trembling around my champagne glass. My college roommate Lisa appeared at my elbow, her face flushed with indignation. "That absolute witch!" she hissed. "Want me to accidentally spill red wine on her?" "No," I managed, though the image was tempting. "I won't stoop to her level." But Margaret was just getting started. During the cocktail hour, she made her rounds, each conversation another small dagger. "To my father," she said. "Frank, you must be so proud. Emily's done well for herself, considering everything." The pause after considering hung in the air like a bad smell. To my bridesmaids, clustered near the bar, she observed, "Such interesting dress choices. Girls. Emily always has been. Creative with color. I would have gone more traditional. But then, I'm old-fashioned." The photographer, still confused about the white dress situation, kept including Margaret in shots meant for just Daniel and me. "Mother of the groom, too," he'd ask, and Margaret would glide into frame before I could object. In one particularly galling moment, she stood between us, her white dress creating a bizarre optical illusion where it was unclear who the actual bride was. "Mom," Daniel finally said, his voice strained, "maybe you should change into something else. You brought another outfit, right?" Margaret's eyes widened in practiced innocence. "Change, Daniel. Darling, I didn't bring anything else. This dress cost a fortune. I had it specially made. Surely Emily understands that not everything is about her." The irony of that statement, delivered at my wedding reception, was so acute that Daniel's brother Tom actually choked on his drink. But Daniel, caught between his mother and his new wife, just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The dinner seating made things worse. Margaret had somehow arranged to be at a table directly in the sight line from ours, positioned so that whenever guests looked at the head table, they'd see her too. She held court throughout the meal, her laugh carrying over the conversations, drawing attention away from Daniel and me. "You know," she said loudly enough for our table to hear, "when I married Daniel's father, my mother-in-law wore navy. Such a respectful color. She understood that a wedding was about the bride, not about making statements." She paused, sipping her wine. "But times change, I suppose. These days, everyone wants to be the center of attention." My maid of honor, Jessica, gripped her fork so tightly I thought it might bend. "She's really going there," she whispered. "She's really making this about respect while wearing a wedding dress to your wedding." The worst part was the guests' reactions. Some were clearly uncomfortable, shooting me sympathetic glances. Others seemed oblivious to the psychological warfare happening in front of them, but a significant number, mostly Margaret's friends, appeared to be enjoying the spectacle. I caught them whispering behind their hands, their eyes dancing between Margaret and me like spectators at a tennis match. "Such a shame," I heard one of them murmur. "Emily seems like a nice girl, but she clearly doesn't understand how things work in this family." When the DJ announced our first dance, Margaret actually stood up as if to join us, then sat back down with exaggerated disappointment. "Oh, just the couple. How modern. In my day, the whole wedding party danced together first." As Daniel led me onto the floor, I could feel her eyes boring into my back. The song we'd chosen, At Last by Etta James, played as we swayed together, but all I could think about was the white beacon of Margaret's dress in my peripheral vision, impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered in my ear. "I had no idea she'd do this." But that was the problem, wasn't it? He never had any idea what his mother was capable of, or worse, he chose not to see it. The moment arrived at 8:15 p.m., just as the sun was setting behind the vineyard hills, painting everything in deceptive golden light. Margaret rose from her table, champagne glass in hand, and tapped it with her ring. The massive diamond that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother. The one she'd pointedly told me would someday go to Daniel's wife when the time is right. "Excuse me, everyone," her voice carried across the barn with practiced authority. "I'd like to propose a toast to the happy couple." The room quieted. My stomach dropped. Daniel reached for my hand under the table, but I couldn't tell if it was to comfort me or himself. Margaret moved to the center of the room, her white dress catching the light from every angle. The DJ, thinking this was planned, actually put a spotlight on her. She stood there, radiant in stolen glory, and began. "When Daniel first brought Emily home," she started, her smile sharp as glass. "I thought, well, this is different." And different she certainly is. She paused for effect, letting the words sink in. "Emily comes from humble beginnings. She's worked very hard to get where she is, and that's admirable. Not everyone can learn the graces that come naturally to some." My father's face had turned red. My cousins exchanged shocked glances, but Margaret was just warming up. "Marriage is about growth," she continued, swirling her champagne. "And Emily has so much room to grow. Why, just last month, she didn't even know which fork to use at the Pemberton charity dinner." She laughed, that tinkling sound echoing off the barn rafters. "But don't worry, dear. Some brides take years to learn grace, but maybe Emily will get there one day." The silence that followed was deafening. 200 guests sat frozen, unsure whether to laugh, applaud, or flee. Margaret stood there, still smiling, still holding her glass high as if she'd just delivered a blessing instead of a curse. "After all," she added, her eyes finding mine across the room, "we can't all be natural-born ladies. Some of us have to work at it." "Isn't that right?" Emily. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen, precisely aimed. She'd managed to call me low-class, graceless, and unworthy in front of everyone I cared about, all while maintaining the veneer of a loving toast. Daniel's hand had gone slack in mine. I turned to look at him, waiting for him to stand up, to say something, to defend his wife at her own wedding. His mouth was open, his face pale, but no words came. He just sat there, paralyzed by the woman who'd controlled him his entire life. His silence was almost worse than his mother's words. Almost. To Daniel and Emily, Margaret concluded, raising her glass higher. "May their marriage be full of surprises." A few people raised their glasses uncertainly. Most didn't. My maid of honor, Jessica, looked ready to tackle Margaret to the ground. My father had actually stood up, but my stepmother pulled him back down. The tension in the room was so thick you could practically see it, hanging in the air like smoke. Margaret made her way back to her table, her train trailing behind her like a victory banner. She sat down with perfect poise, as if she hadn't just attempted to destroy her son's wedding, as if she hadn't just humiliated me in front of everyone I knew. Did she really just... My cousin Amanda whispered from the next table. She did, her husband confirmed, his voice full of disbelief. I looked around the room at the faces of our guests, some sympathetic, some horrified, some clearly entertained by the drama. These were supposed to be the people celebrating our love, our future. Instead, they'd become an audience to my degradation. Daniel finally found his voice, but it was too little, too late. Mom, that was... What? Darling, Margaret interrupted, her voice sweet as poison. I was just welcoming Emily to the family. Properly. Someone has to set standards, after all. That word standards echoed in my head. Standards. As if I was something substandard, something that needed to be improved or endured. As if my love for her son, my accomplishments, my very self weren't enough. The DJ, clearly desperate to move past the uncomfortable moment, started playing background music again. Conversations slowly resumed. But they were different now, hushed, awkward, full of sideways glances at our table. Emily, Daniel whispered, finally turning to me. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. But that was exactly the problem. He never knew what to say when it came to his mother. He never knew how to stand up to her, how to protect me from her, how to choose his wife over the woman who'd raised him. I sat there in my mother's transformed dress, feeling every inch the outsider Margaret had painted me to be. The fairy lights that had seemed magical now felt like spotlights exposing my humiliation. The beautiful barn felt like a courtroom where I'd been tried and found wanting, and Margaret sat there in her white dress, sipping her champagne, victorious. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment to breathe, to think, to keep from falling apart completely. But instead of surrendering to tears, I found myself staring at my reflection in the mirror, and what I saw surprised me. The woman looking back wasn't broken. She was angry. And in that anger, I found something I'd almost forgotten my own strength. Memory has a funny way of surfacing when you need it most. Standing there, I remembered being 18, sitting in a financial aid office at 3:45 p.m., being told I didn't qualify for enough loans to attend Oregon State. I remembered not crying then either. Instead, I'd walked straight to the job board and signed up for 3 different positions: campus bookstore during the day, restaurant hostess at night, freelance typing on weekends. I remembered being 23, in my first real marketing job, when my boss took credit for my campaign idea in front of the entire board. I'd wanted to quit, to scream, to call him out. Instead, I'd documented everything, built relationships with the board members independently, and when promotion time came, they knew exactly whose ideas had driven our success. That boss was gone within 6 months. I got his job. I remembered being 28 when Daniel had been laid off from his architecture firm during the recession. He'd been devastated, ready to give up, move back in with his parents. Margaret had actually suggested it, said it would be practical, but I'd supported us both for 8 months on my salary alone, never once making him feel lesser for it. I'd come home from 12-hour days to find him depressed on the couch, and I'd told him we were partners, that this was temporary, that his worth wasn't tied to his paycheck. Where had that woman gone? The one who'd fought for everything she had. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. Jessica's about to punch Margaret. Also, your dad is planning something. Get back here. Another from my cousin. Half the room is on your side. Don't let her win. And one from Sarah, Daniel's own sister. She's done this before. Don't let her do it to you. Fight back. I thought about my mother then, really thought about her. Not the sick woman in the hospital bed, but the vibrant force she'd been before cancer. She'd been a legal secretary, married to a truck driver, Living in suburban Portland, everything Margaret would have sneered at. But she'd also been the woman who'd stood up to my school principal when he'd tried to deny me advanced placement classes because girls often struggle with advanced mathematics. She'd been the woman who'd taught me to make my own clothes when we couldn't afford store-bought, turning poverty into creativity. "You come from a long line of fighters," she'd told me once. "We may not have money or fancy names, but we have grit. Don't ever forget that." I'd forgotten. Somewhere between falling in love with Daniel and trying to fit into his world, I'd forgotten that I didn't need to fit. I'd already carved out my own space in this world through sheer determination. The bathroom door opened, and Jessica poked her head in. "Emily, you okay? Because if you need me to accidentally trip while carrying red wine near Margaret—" "No," I said, but this time my voice was steady. "I've got this." "You sure? Because your dad is about 2 seconds from giving his own toast, and I don't think it's going to be friendly." I turned from the mirror, and Jessica must have seen something in my face because she stepped back slightly. "Oh," she said. "Oh, you're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing you did before the Henderson presentation." "The thing you did when that creep at the bar wouldn't leave me alone. The Emily is done playing thing." She was right. I was done playing. Done pretending that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity. Done acting like Margaret's behavior was acceptable just because she was Daniel's mother. I thought about all the warnings I'd ignored. Sarah telling me about Tom's ex-wife. My father's constant concern about how Margaret treated me. Even my friends at work, who'd met Margaret once at a company event and immediately labeled her toxic. "She's threatened by you," my mentor had said. "You're everything she pretends to be successful on your own merits." I'd dismissed them all, thinking love would be enough, that Daniel would eventually see what was happening and stop it. But love without respect wasn't enough, and Daniel's inability to defend me had just shown me exactly where I stood in his hierarchy of priorities. But here's what Margaret didn't understand about people like me, people who'd clawed their way up from humble beginnings, as she'd so kindly put it. We didn't break easily. We'd already been tested by life in ways her money had protected her from. We'd learned to fight with intelligence when we couldn't fight with influence. And most importantly, we'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't staying quiet and taking the high road. Sometimes it's standing up and telling the truth. Consequences be damned. "Jessica," I said, smoothing my mother's dress, "go tell the DJ I'd like to say something after the father-daughter dance." Her eyes widened. "You're going to—" "I'm going to give a toast of my own." The father-daughter dance ended at 9:23 p.m., and I walked directly to the DJ stand. My hands weren't shaking anymore. My voice, when I took the microphone, was clear and strong. "Good evening, everyone," I began, and the room gradually quieted. "I wanted to take a moment to thank you all for being here and to share something important about what marriage means to me." Margaret's head snapped up from her table. I saw her eyes narrow, calculating whether this was a threat. Good. Let her wonder. "When I was 14, I continued, moving to the center of the dance floor, "my mother died. Before she passed, she told me something I've never forgotten. Emily, never let anyone make you feel small. The moment you accept that, you've already lost." I paused, making eye contact with guests around the room. My father was leaning forward, his expression intense. Daniel looked confused but alert. "For the past 3 years, I've been trying to join the Hart family, and for 3 years, I've been told in ways both subtle and obvious that I'm not quite good enough. My career in marketing, interesting, but not impressive. My father's job as a truck driver, something to overcome rather than be proud of. My mother's dress, which I'm wearing today, transformed with love and memory, vintage, which we all know is code for outdated." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret started to stand, but Tom actually pulled her back down. "Tonight, my mother-in-law." I gestured to Margaret in her white dress, gave a beautiful toast about how I need to learn grace, how I don't know which fork to use, how I'm different, which in her vocabulary means lesser. And you know what, she's right. I am different. The room was completely silent now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. I'm different because I earned everything I have. My degree paid for with 3 jobs and sleepless nights. My position as marketing director at 32, built on countless hours of proving myself in rooms full of people who assumed I was there to fetch coffee. My relationship with Daniel founded on supporting him through unemployment, depression, and family pressure without ever making him feel diminished. I turned to face Margaret directly. But you wouldn't know about earning things, would you? Margaret. You married into money, inherited more, and have spent 40 years looking down on people who actually work for their achievements. You've confused privilege with grace, snobbery with standards. Someone gasped. I didn't care who. Let's talk about grace, shall we? Grace isn't knowing which fork to use that's just memorization. Grace is welcoming your son's fiancée into your family without making her feel like an intruder. Grace is recognizing that love doesn't care about tax brackets or lineage. Grace is definitely not wearing white to your son's wedding to upstage his bride. The last words hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret's face had gone from pale to red. For 3 years, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I've endured the backhanded compliments, the jokes about my background, the constant implications that Daniel was settling. I've smiled through dinners where you've rewritten history to make my accomplishments sound like accidents. I've stayed silent while you've tried to control our wedding, our choices, our life. I took a breath, feeling the power of finally saying it all out loud. But tonight, you made a critical error. Margaret, you assumed my silence was weakness, that my politeness was submission, that my love for your son meant I'd accept any treatment you decided to dish out. You assumed that because I came from humble beginnings, I'd be grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance you threw my way. Daniel stood up. For a moment, I thought he was going to stop me. Instead, he walked over and stood beside me, not touching, not taking the microphone, just standing there, choosing a side. Finally. Here's what you don't understand, I said, looking around the room at all the faces, some shocked, some admirative, some uncomfortable. Those of us who build ourselves from nothing, we're not afraid of people like you. We've faced worse than disapproval. We've survived more than social embarrassment. We've learned that respect isn't given, it's demanded. I turned back to Margaret, who sat frozen in her white dress, her carefully constructed superiority crumbling. So here's my toast. I raised an invisible glass. To standards the real kind, where we treat people with dignity regardless of their background. To grace the kind that builds others up instead of tearing them down. To marriage which starts today with me making it crystal clear that I will not be diminished, dismissed, or disrespected in my own family. I paused, letting the words sink in. And to my mother-in-law, who taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that staying silent in the face of cruelty isn't keeping the peace, it's enabling abuse. Thank you, Margaret, for helping me find my voice again. I'd almost forgotten how powerful it could be. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, from the back of the room, a single person started clapping. It was Sarah, Daniel's sister, standing up at her table, her applause deliberate and strong. Tom joined her, then his wife. My father stood next, clapping with tears streaming down his face. Like a wave building momentum, the applause spread. My cousins, my college friends, my work colleagues, they all rose to their feet, even some of Margaret's own friends. The younger ones who'd perhaps been on the receiving end of similar treatment began to clap. Within moments, over half the room was standing, but not everyone. Margaret's closest allies, the old guard of her social circle, sat rigid in their chairs, their faces masks of disapproval. I caught fragments of their whispered outrage. The disrespect! How dare she? Poor Margaret. Margaret herself remained frozen, her face cycling through emotions like a broken kaleidoscope shock, rage, humiliation. disbelief. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The white dress that had been her weapon now seemed to glow like a beacon of her miscalculation. Daniel's Aunt Martha, who'd been Margaret's friend for 30 years, stood up slowly and walked over to Margaret. But instead of comforting her, Martha said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "You brought this on yourself. Maggie, we've watched you do this for years. First to Tom's wife, now to Emily. Someone was bound to call you out eventually." The defection of one of her own inner circle seemed to break something in Margaret. She turned to Daniel, her voice shrill. "Are you going to let her speak to your mother this way?" Daniel looked at his mother, then at me, then back at his mother. When he spoke, his voice carried across the room. "Mom, you wore a wedding dress to my wedding. You've spent 3 years trying to break up my relationship. You just insulted my wife in front of everyone we know. Emily's right enough is enough." A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. Daniel had never, in all the years I'd known him, publicly stood up to his mother. My maid of honor, Jessica, called out from her table. Thank God someone finally said it. This broke the remaining tension, and nervous laughter scattered through the room. Even the wedding photographer, who'd been discreetly capturing everything, lowered his camera and started clapping. The catering staff, who'd witnessed who knows how many wedding dramas, were exchanging glances of amazement. An elderly woman I didn't recognize someone from Margaret's side stood up and walked over to me. "Young lady," she said in a voice that commanded attention, "I'm Margaret's cousin Eleanor. I'm 92 years old, and I've been waiting 40 years for someone to put that woman in her place." Brava. This seemed to be the final straw for Margaret's remaining supporters. Even they couldn't argue with the family matriarch. The whispers shifted. Margaret has always been difficult. Remember what she did at the charity auction. Poor Emily, having to deal with this. The DJ, who'd been frozen at his station throughout my speech, finally seemed to remember his job. He started playing music, something upbeat and celebratory that felt like a victory anthem. People began to move, to talk, to break the spell that had held the room captive. My father reached me first, pulling me into a fierce hug. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered. "So damn proud." Friends and family surrounded me, offering congratulations, support, and admiration. "That was the most badass thing I've ever seen," my cousin Amanda said. "Like, I want to hire you to give speeches at all my enemies' events." But through the crowd, I kept my eyes on Margaret. She sat alone at her table now, even her husband having moved away to get a drink. The white dress that had been meant to overshadow me had become her shroud. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, as if my words had physically reduced her. Then something unexpected happened. Margaret's mother, Gloria, a 95-year-old force of nature who'd been sitting quietly all evening, wheeled herself over to Margaret's table. "Margaret Ann Hart," she said in a voice that could have cut glass. "I am appalled. I did not raise you to be this kind of woman. Apologize to Emily. Now." The room, which had started to resume normal conversation, quieted again. Everyone watched as Margaret struggled with her pride, her humiliation, her lifetime of never being held accountable. She started, then stopped. "This is ridiculous." "What's ridiculous," Gloria continued, "is a grown woman trying to upstage a bride at her own wedding. What's ridiculous is 3 years of psychological warfare against a lovely young woman whose only crime was falling in love with your son. Apologize, or I'll have my lawyer revisit that trust fund we discussed." The threat of financial consequences seemed to penetrate Margaret's shock, but instead of apologizing, she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air," she announced to no one in particular. As she walked toward the exit, her white train trailing behind her, I noticed something extraordinary. People actually stepped back to let her pass, not out of respect, but as if her toxicity might be contagious. The white dress that had demanded attention now seemed like a costume obvious, desperate, pathetic. Margaret never came back to the reception. She fled into the Oregon night in her white dress, her grand plan to dominate my wedding having spectacularly backfired. Her husband, Richard, quietly apologized to Daniel and me before following her out at 10:15 p.m. His shoulders slumped with what looked like years of exhaustion. The transformation of the reception after her departure was immediate and remarkable. The oppressive atmosphere lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. People began to genuinely celebrate, to laugh without looking over their shoulders, to dance without restraint. It was as if Margaret had been a dark cloud over the entire event, and her absence allowed joy to finally break through. Daniel pulled me aside near the vineyard's garden at 10:45 p.m., where string lights created a canopy of stars. "Emily," he said, his eyes filled with something I'd never seen before, a mixture of admiration and regret. "I should have done that years ago. I should have stood up to her the first time she disrespected you." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You should have." "I was a coward," he admitted. "I kept thinking if I just kept the peace, she'd eventually accept you. But you're right, my silence was enabling her." He took my hands in his. "Can you forgive me?" I looked at this man I'd loved for 3 years, who'd finally chosen me over his mother's manipulation. "I can forgive you, Daniel. But things have to change. I won't spend our marriage fighting for basic respect in your family." "Our family," he corrected. "And you won't have to fight anymore. I promise." The rest of the reception was everything a wedding should be. My father gave a beautiful toast about strength and love, carefully avoiding any mention of the earlier drama. Daniel's grandmother Gloria commanded the microphone for a few minutes, sharing embarrassing stories about Margaret's own wedding disasters, much to everyone's delight. Sarah announced that she'd been recording Margaret's toast and my response on her phone, "For posterity," which earned her a mix of laughter and applause. We cut the cake at 11:30 p.m., and Daniel smooshed a piece in my face despite our agreement not to. But I didn't mind. It felt playful, light, free everything the first half of the reception hadn't been. The photographer later told me he'd never captured such a dramatic shift in a wedding's energy, from tense to triumphant. As we danced to the last song at 1:20, surrounded by the people who truly supported us, Daniel whispered, "You were magnificent tonight. The woman I fell in love with was always strong, but tonight you were invincible." Margaret didn't contact us for 6 months after the wedding. When she finally did, it was through a carefully worded letter, not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that perhaps some boundaries had been crossed, and suggesting we start fresh. I agreed to supervised visits, always in public places, always with Daniel present and actively involved. The white dress became legendary in our social circle. "Remember when Margaret wore white to Emily's wedding?" became shorthand for narcissistic behavior gone too far. Tom's ex-wife actually called me to congratulate me on doing what she'd never had the courage to do. We became friends, bonding over our shared Margaret experiences. But the most surprising aftermath came from Margaret's own social circle. Several of her friends reached out to me privately, sharing their own stories of her cruelty over the years, thanking me for finally holding up a mirror to her behavior. Her influence in Portland society, built on fear and old money, crumbled remarkably quickly once someone had publicly called out the Empress's lack of clothes, or rather, her excess of white ones. Daniel and I just celebrated our 5th anniversary. Margaret attended, wearing navy blue and keeping her comments to herself. She's learned, finally, that I'm not the weak outsider she took me for. I'm the woman who stood up in front of 200 people and refused to be diminished. I'm the woman who married her son, not in spite of my humble beginnings, but because of everything they'd taught me about strength, resilience, and the power of truth. Sometimes, when I'm facing a difficult situation at work or in life, I think back to that moment standing in the barn, microphone in hand, finally saying everything I'd swallowed for 3 years. It reminds me that the best revenge isn't served cold. Sometimes it's served at exactly 9:23 p.m. in front of everyone who matters, wearing your mother's dress and your own courage. The wedding video, which includes both Margaret's toast and my response, sits in our safe deposit box. Not because we ever watch it, but because it's proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the bride gets to wear white and win the war. My mother was right all those years ago. The moment you accept feeling small, you've already lost. But the moment you stand up and refuse to shrink, that's the moment you don't just win, you soar. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts and experiences. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to diminish you? How did you find your courage? I read every comment and would love to hear from you.